Good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. I'm Brenda Daly, Director of the Center for Excellence in the Arts and Humanities, and we're very happy to have you here tonight in this busy season, Iowa being the center of all campaigns, I guess, going on in the nation, right? I want to begin by thanking our sponsors. We have many because, as you've surmised, this is a highly interdisciplinary topic, genomics. I'll then make a few brief announcements, and then finally I'll turn to introducing our series, just a little bit about why we came up with this idea of the Book of Life in a Genomic Age, and then introducing our speaker. Our sponsors include Humanities Iowa, Center for Integrated Animal Genomics, the Committee on Lectures, which is, of course, funded by the government of the student body, Integrative Graduate Education and Research Trainingship, Plant Science Institute, Program for Women in Science and Engineering, College of Liberal Arts, Ames Public Library, and Monsanto. How's that for a list? The brief announcements. There's a clipboard going around. Would you be sure to sign it? This is part of the requirement for our Humanities Iowa grant, and they're a major funder. The second announcement is that the speaker's, one of her early books is on sale. I'll mention another forthcoming book later. And the third announcement is that I would ask you to go to the center aisle and speak from the mic when you ask questions following the lecture. That way everyone else can hear the question and participate more readily in the discussion. And we'll cut that off at 8:30 because our speaker needs to go to dinner, and you know what happens in Ames, Iowa. The restaurants close. You better get there by 8:45 or you're in big trouble. So, to begin. Tonight's talk is part of the Center's programming series for this fall, and our title is The Book of Life in a Genomic Age. The phrase, the Book of Life, comes from Matt Ridley's primer for the non-scientist, Genome, the autobiography of a species, in 23 chapters. He asks readers, and I quote, to imagine that the genome is a book, a term more accurate, he says, than blueprint. He argues further that, quote, the idea of the genome as a book is not, strictly speaking, even a metaphor. It is literally true. Now, to some, that might cause anxiety and alarm, that kind of language. But to somebody like me, an English teacher who grew up loving books and reading and thinking about them, I think, aha, this means that probably I can understand what he's talking about. If the Book of Life can be read in more than a metaphorical sense, this is very exciting. The question of language is important, I believe, because all of us, all American citizens, and not just scientists certainly, need at least a rudimentary knowledge of genomic sciences and technologies in order to consider both its promises, I think, and its perils. Genetic research is changing how we think about the food we eat, how we think about our bodies, even how we define what it means to be human. And we need to be informed to make intelligent choices. If we're going to be intervening in evolution itself, we need to understand the kinds of choices that we're making. Pardon me. Tonight's speaker, Professor Priscilla Wald, will address the issue of language, among other concerns, in her lecture. Professor Wald is in both the departments of English and Women's Studies at Duke University. Her current work focuses on the intersections among the law, literature, science, and medicine. She is especially interested in analyzing how the language, narratives, and images in the popular media register and promote a particular understanding of the science that is steeped in often misleading cultural biases and assumptions. In her research, her teaching, her professional activities, she is committed to promoting conversations among scholars from science, medicine, law, and cultural studies in order to facilitate a richer understanding of these issues. And if you happen to catch her on radio, WOI at 11, you know that she speaks in a way that's accessible to the broad public as well on these complicated issues. She has a new book forthcoming in January titled Contagious: Cultures, Carriers, and the Outbreak Narrative. Great title. Can't wait until that comes out. She's the author of another book, Constituting Americans, Cultural Anxiety and Narrative Form, as well as, of course, many essays, one of which I read is titled What's in a Cell, that was really intriguing. As I mentioned, the earlier book, not related to tonight's talk, is on sale over there. She's also on editorial boards, American Literature, PMLA, which literary folks in the audience at least will recognize as foremost journals in our field. Her secondary appointments are interesting too. She has one in women's studies. She's on the steering committee of the Center for Genome Ethics, Law and Policy, and for ISIS, which stands for Information Sciences plus Information Studies, the internal advisory committee of the Institute for Genome Sciences and Policy, and is an affiliate of the Center for Medical Ethics and Humanities. Her talk tonight is entitled Clones, Chimeras, and Other Creatures of the Biotechnical Revolution Toward a Genomic Mythology. Please join me in giving her a warm welcome.
Thank you for the great introduction, and thank you all for coming out tonight. And I've had a wonderful day attending classes and lunch with students, and it's been great. And please signal me if I start moving too fast. I have a tendency to do that. On June 26, 2000, some of you may remember, William Jefferson Clinton announced the completion of a map of the human genome, calling it, and I'm quoting, oh, okay, is that better? Calling it, I'm quoting, without a doubt, the most important, most wondrous map ever produced by humankind, remarking on the extraordinary scale of economic, technological, scientific change that was sweeping across the modern world. He pronounced the developments represented by this achievement, I'm still quoting, almost too awesome fully to comprehend. We were learning nothing less, he mused, than the language in which God created life. And I want you to notice the wording up there. This is, of course, Clinton at the press conference, and he's standing here with Craig Venter, who was the head of Celera Genomics at the time, which was the private corporation involved in mapping the genome, and on the other side is Francis Collins, who spearheaded the public initiative to map the human genome. And please notice the language in the foreground, well, background, but really foreground of this shot, decoding the book of life and a milestone of humanity. Now, genomics had been very much in the news and in popular fiction and film prior to this 2000 conference. Can everyone hear me all right if I move around and don't? Can anyone not hear me? Of course. Dumb question. Okay. But after this conference, it became a veritable obsession. Media, event. It became a veritable obsession. You could not open a newspaper without reading about new biotechnological developments and without seeing it in popular novels and popular fiction. Media watchers like myself call this an explosion. So after 2000, there was an explosion, which was testifying to the fact that this topic had fully saturated the collective imagination. Now, tonight I'm going to take up 3 questions associated with that saturation. So you've heard, as Brenda said, that there are claims about our changing conceptions of human being. This is one of the lines that you hear in the media, you hear in popular fiction and film. And my first question is, are they really changing? these conceptions of human being? And if so, how? And I'm as interested in the fact that we're claiming that they are as I am in whether they actually are. Secondly, how can we understand the combination, the unique combination of fear and fascination with which we're responding to the idea of those changes, and what are the consequences of this response? And finally, what can we learn by paying really close attention to the language that we're using to introduce the discoveries produced by genomic research? And I want to take as my first example Clinton's phrase, learning the language in which God created life, also decoding the book of life, and, as Francis Collins says, the language of God. These concepts, these phrases, allow us, I think, to understand why people have the sense that the scientific research is maybe challenging or threatening to our religious beliefs. It also conveys the momentousness of the discovery. These phrases actually aren't new. They go back to the 1950s. In the 1950s, people were talking about the book of life, the language of God, and so on, and they don't seem to be losing their power. So I think it's something we really need to think about. And finally, as I'm going to suggest in this talk, this language helps us understand how genomics is being incorporated into myths for our contemporary moment. And I want to pause for a minute to define what I mean by myth, because I'm using that word in its very traditional sense. I see myths as explanatory stories that express the collective identity of a group, and this is a standard anthropological definition, through several features. First of all, they tend to reach back into a primordial past. And if you think about genomic stories that have been in the news, there's all this talk about African Eve, about discovering human remains in Africa and being able to chart and chronicle human migrations and the and human history in a new way. So this is part of this primordial past. It's also science. I don't mean myth instead of science. I mean the way it's being incorporated into our stories. So they reach deep into this past, and they also, myths, tend to suggest a connection with divinity and with superhuman beings. That's another characteristic of myth. They often depict an impending threat of apocalypse, so the idea of the species going extinct, tempered with the reassurance of renewal. So, the stories are both about this threat that may be apocalyptic, but in the end it's contained and they end up being stories of renewal. Myths tend to accompany a paradigm shift, a new way of looking at the world, with a reaffirmation of traditional values. They're necessary, they help us negotiate change, and I'm going to return to this at the end of the talk. I think it's very important that we, in fact, recognize the mythic features of some of the stories we're telling, because in and of themselves, myths are great. But when we start believing in them and thinking that they are conveying the science, we may run into some trouble. To address these questions, I'm going to focus particularly on the fanciful creatures, the hybrids, chimeras, and monsters that populate our collective imagination as we attempt to make sense of the changes that are going to come from genomic information. Now, this is a chimera, and originally chimeras were mythological creatures that were very specific. And as you can see, it has the body of a lion, the head of a woman, and the wings of a bird. And this is a characteristic classical chimera. But the word has become more conventional within genomics and has come to mean any transgenic creation, whether in reality, in our fantasy, I love this little guy, or in our popular culture. And this, some of you may recognize, is the actress Hayden Panettiere. I'm not suggesting that she herself is a chimera, but she plays one on TV. She's one of my two favorite characters from the hit CBS TV show Heroes. And I'll be talking a little bit about that later when I also get to X-Men. She is more accurately a mutant than a chimera, but she showed up on in Google Images. Most disturbingly, I also showed up in Google Images when I wrote chimera. And I was a little puzzled about that, but it was the title of my talk. I was very glad to know. So I am now, thanks to all of you, in a chimera in Google Images. Okay, so Hayden Panettiere and I, chimeras. I want to say a quick word about my method. Now, what I do in my work is I look closely at how genomics is being talked about in the mainstream media and in popular fiction and film, because I believe those are the places where we work out as a group, as a collective, general public, where we work out our responses to new discoveries, new theories, new concepts, new ideas from science and other things as well. So accounts of scientific research introduce a vocabulary. And what I mean by vocabulary is very broad. They introduce terms. Now, this may not be a new term, but it appears with new frequency, right, in the genomic revolution, as part of the genomic revolution. So certain words get out there in the public. And phrases. I talked about African Eve and stories associated with those phrases. So you see the phrase African Eve and you start to think about migration patterns and human history and so forth and so on. This is both a storyline and a phrase that's getting out into the general public. They can be visual images, and anyone who has ever watched CSI or anything like it knows a gel sequence when they see one, and we have a very strong sense of what information we can gain from this image. You know, it will tell us the guilt or innocence of the character, it can tell us paternity, and, you know, all of this is somewhat misleading. It's somewhat true and somewhat misleading. So this vocabulary, in a broad sense, circulates through the mainstream media and popular fiction and film, and it becomes part of our daily lives. We develop an understanding of the science that way. Now, there are two things that I'm going to look at. One of them is how in the process, this is a dialectical process. You never put a new word out there without trying to understand it in terms of another word or concept that you already know. These things circulate through frameworks, through stories that are already familiar to us, and they both change in the process, right? The vocabulary changes and the stories change. What happens in that process is a certain kind of distortion, right? So the science gets distorted as it's circulating through the media and popular fiction and film. But I think the popular fiction and film also do other things. They allow us, they kind of magnify or amplify the concepts and the scenarios, and they allow us to look not only at the distortions, but also some of our deeply held convictions. And the one I'm talking about tonight, again, is what it means to be human. So I'm going to start with one of the earliest and most formative novels in the English language, which is one of those frameworks that I was talking about, one of the stories that we tell over and over again, which takes scientific experimentation as its topic, and I mean, of course, Mary Shelley's 1818 Frankenstein. Now, I assume that a lot of you have read Frankenstein, but many of you may know Frankenstein through the films, and so I'm going to just very quickly go over the plot, because the book is very, very different from the films. And in the book, Victor Frankenstein is a healthy young man, a nobleman who lives in Switzerland with his loving family, and he's interested in natural history. His family sends him to another town to study at a university, as many of you are doing, and he meets up with a professor, as many of you have, who really catches his imagination and inspires him to begin to think outside the box. And what Victor Frankenstein becomes obsessed with is creating life. He wants to be the progenitor of a new race of creatures. He wants to be like God. So you can already see the problem emerging. And Mary Shelley makes very clear that one of the huge problems that comes out of this is that Victor Frankenstein gets so focused on his scientific research that he loses touch with all of his healthy social connections. He doesn't get in touch with his family, doesn't call home. So I remind you all, please, undergraduates, go home, call home. I'm a parent of a college-age son myself. Call home. He doesn't call home. He loses touch with his fiancée and his best friend and all of the socializing influences that had been keeping him wholesome before. And lo and behold, he's incredibly successful. And the creature, and Mary Shelley does not use the word monster. It is not a monster, it's a creature. The creature opens his eyes, Frankenstein freaks out, runs into the night, and leaves the monster to wander out and look for love in all the wrong places, literally. So the monster, which is treated very sympathetically by Mary Shelley, starts wandering around looking for human connection of any kind. And everybody responds to the monster by going, running from him, throwing things at him, bottles, sticks, rocks, whatever they have. And the creature, sorry I called him a monster, the creature gradually becomes monstrous because of these experiences. So what Mary Shelley is describing is how scientific experimentation, by not taking into account the social world in which the scientist is performing the experimentation, can create monsters, okay? And so this is, she helps us understand the concept of monstrosity, which for her is something that arises because the creature is put into a situation where there are no social categories that it fits. There are no classifications for this creature, therefore it becomes monstrous. So this is very much a part of Mary Shelley's point. It is important to read our creatures and our monsters for what they tell us about our own social categories. They make visible the things we don't know we're assuming. Mary Shelley's story explains to us why we have inherited this sense of a tension between science and religion and between science and society. But I think even more importantly, Mary Shelley has captured the fact that in her moment, and remember this is not long after the French Revolution and the American Revolution and the rights of man, changing definitions of what it means to be human, one of the things that Mary Shelley's book I think so powerfully does is explore how troubling it is to people when the concept of life or human being begins to shift. Right? These are definitions that are always shifting. We may not be aware of them, but they're always changing. And when there's a radical shift, people get very anxious. And the monster in Mary Shelley is very much about that. Now, the amplification of fiction and film that I talked about, the idea that they can really extend these scenarios. It isn't just we're going to have a very quick journalistic discussion, but they can really play out, for instance, what it means to for a scientific researcher not to think about social categories and so on. They can really extend that scenario. These extended scenarios, as I said, really allow us to contemplate our own values, our own assumptions, our own deeply held convictions. And it shows why these media are so useful to bioethicists. They give us insight into who and what gets stigmatized and how and why. They give us insight into the underlying assumptions that may actually be getting in the way of the messages that we think we're putting out and are trying to put out. And in a very profound way, they enfranchise our speculation. They let us think about things that we're not even aware that we're thinking. They kind of act as a giant mirror for our most deeply held assumptions as a collective entity. And I think it's very important that they do this. And I want to give you an anecdote, or allow me a quick anecdote before moving into my examples of what I'm talking about. And this is several years ago, Leon Kass. How many of you know that name, Leon Kass? Leon Kass, who at the time was the head of the President's Council on Bioethics, which is a position he held from 2002 to 2005, came to Duke. And Leon Kass was extremely anti-cloning, he was anti-stem cell research, and he was a key player in the Bush administration's science policy, determining where funding was going to go and determining what was and was not going to be allowed with federal funding at all. And so Leon Kass came to give this talk on cloning at Duke, and he told us the following anecdote. He said, on my way here, I was in a cab, and the cab driver asked me where I was going. And I told him what I was doing, and the cab driver said, cloning, that's disgusting. And he said to us, this man became a representative for him of the attitude of the general public, and he said to us, you see, the general public knows that cloning is disgusting, knows there's something wrong with this. And as ethicists, we really have to take into account how people feel about the scientific research. And he actually compared the researchers to Dr. Frankenstein. He said, we cannot let these researchers like Victor Frankenstein get so holed up in their laboratories that they're not in touch with what society thinks and wants and feels. And this to him was good evidence, and the way he began the talk, that we really, really should restrict this research. Now, my question for him, which I never got to ask, and would that he were here now, is, well, but where did the cab driver get his ideas about cloning? What did he actually think cloning was, and where did he get his impressions that it was disgusting? So I'm going to give you several examples now from popular fiction and film, and ask you to think very seriously about your own attitudes about biotechnological research, cloning, and so forth, and where they might be coming from. My first example is from a 1976 horror novel by a man named Ira Levin, whom you may know as the author of Rosemary's Baby. And this book, called The Boys from Brazil, is a wonderful novel about Joseph Mengele, alive and well. Probably most of you know that name. He was a Nazi scientist, the premier Nazi scientist. He's alive and well, living in Brazil, and engaged in a plot to clone Adolf Hitler. And this it was made into a film, and this young man was one of the Hitler clones. In this book, there's also a Nazi hunter, a very famous Nazi hunter named Joseph Lieberman, and he begins to catch on to this plot. But he doesn't understand the science. And so a young university student that he meets up with, giving a talk one day on this evidence and what he's found, says to him, "Oh, you must go meet my professor. My professor is working on this cutting-edge science, and he will explain to you what this science is all about." So this passage is the scientist's explanation of mononuclear reproduction, which is the more technical term for cloning. And I'm going to read it to you. In mononuclear reproduction, the nucleus of an egg cell is destroyed, leaving the body of the cell unharmed. This is done by radiation and is, of course, microsurgery of the most sophisticated order. Into the enucleated egg cell is put the nucleus of a body cell of the organism to be reproduced. The nucleus of a body cell, not a sex cell. We now have exactly what we had at this point in natural reproduction. An egg cell with 46 chromosomes in its nucleus, a fertilized egg cell which in a nutrient solution proceeds to duplicate and divide. When it reaches the 16 or 32 cell stage, this takes 4 or 5 days, it can be implanted in the uterus of its mother, who isn't its mother at all, biologically speaking. She supplied an egg cell, and now she's supplying a proper environment for the embryo's growth, but she's given it nothing of her own genetic environment. The child, when it's born, has neither father nor mother, only a donor, the giver of the nucleus, of whom it's an exact duplicate. Its chromosomes and genes are identical to the donor's. Instead of a new and unique individual, we have an existing one repeated. Now, I've taught this book several times in a class that is designed for first-year undergraduates who are planning to go into either scientific research or policy work involving genomics. And I say, so they know science, and I say to them, is this scientifically accurate? And they all say, yeah, it's really impressive. For a horror novel from the 1970s, I wouldn't expect to find this. It's very impressive. And I sit there enigmatically with my best Mona Lisa smile, and they start to say, oh, you don't think it's scientifically accurate, do you? And they go back and they dig, and finally someone says, wait a minute, neither father nor mother biologically? That's not true. Bingo. And so this is one of the examples of how very subtly, and I don't think intentionally at all, we get the wrong impression of science. And I will explain how. As most of you probably know, if I clone myself, my clone is basically an identical twin to me, born however many years later. And that means that my genetic mother and father, the terms we use genetically and how we define it, mother and father, are also the mother and father of my identical twin, whenever that twin is born. So it is not the case that a clone does not have a biological mother or father, nor is it correct to say that the clone is not a new and unique individual. The clone is very much a unique individual, just as identical twins are unique individuals. And in fact, biologically speaking, because obviously we're not just a product of our genes, right? We're also a product of our environment. But in addition, biologically, a clone, because the womb contributes to the genetics of the fetus, a clone is actually less identical to the donor than identical twins are to each other. Anyone out there an identical twin? Do you feel like a human being? Would you want someone to think you weren't because you weren't, quote, genetically unique?
I've been told that I'm very similar to my brother, and at times that's difficult to take.
Okay. So imagine how a clone would feel. So what I want to illustrate here, though, what I want you to take away from this is not, oh, Ira Levin got it a little bit wrong. What I want you to take away from this is how we turn clones into monsters, or at least into things that aren't fully human. Because think about how we define human. If something isn't a unique individual, if it doesn't have a mother or father, it's kind of Frankenstein's creature, right? We have the sense of something being manufactured in a laboratory. That's how very subtly we get the message, things like this, that a clone isn't fully human. I have a very brilliant colleague who's a medievalist, and she was saying to me one day, I just am against cloning. I said, why? She said, because I just don't believe they'll have souls. And, you can be against cloning for all kinds of reasons, but it makes no sense to say that a clone wouldn't have a soul. It would be like saying an identical twin wouldn't have a soul. And I know this man out there has a soul. I can tell. I can feel it. So this is how we make monsters. I also want to point out how the current events of the day get pulled into the process. How many of you recognize the name Louise Brown? Who was Louise Brown? The first test tube baby. Anyone know when she was born? 78. July of 1978. But this was under hot debate, IVF technologies, under hot debate in the 1970s in exactly the language we're using now about cloning. And Louise Brown was supposed to be a monster, and she was supposed to feel bereft because somehow she wasn't fully human. Louise Brown is very normal, and I've seen her interviews with her. She's articulate and quite wonderful. So this is the way that the current issues get pulled into the specificity of the science. So this gives us insight into how we might be making clones monstrous, but I also want to think about why we might be making clones monstrous. What are they messing with that are making us uncomfortable? Well, 2 decades after Ira Levin, Lee Silver, a biologist at Princeton, wrote a wonderful book, very controversial and interesting book called Remaking Eden. And one of the things he tells us in this book is that clones are very disturbing to people because a clone's children will also be her mother's children. Thus, with a single act of cloning, we are forced to reconsider the meaning of parents, children, and siblings and how they relate to one another. We don't like our categories messed with. It makes us uncomfortable. I read this to my husband, who's a poet, and he went, ew, cloning does that, ew. What is this like? Where have we seen this in classical literature? Who made this kind of mess with his own family relations? Anyone? Oedipus. Excellent. Oedipus Rex, right? When Oedipus unwittingly murdered his father and slept with his mother, what did he do? They had kids together. Those kids were both his siblings and his children, and everyone said, ooh, and in fact, he brought a plague on, is it Thebes? Thebes. He brought a plague on Thebes. Not great, right? And ultimately blinded himself because he didn't want to look on the monstrous progeny of his incestuous relationship with Jocasta. So we don't like having our categories messed with, whether it's clones or anything else. But again, this isn't specific to cloning. This has everything to do with putting out there how unstable our definitions really are. Not just cloning, but biotechnological research in general. And now I'm going to talk about something that I think is even more controversial than cloning, and that's transgenic experimentation. So here's Alvin Toffler, best known for his book Future Shock, writing in the decade between Ira Levin and Lee Silver in the Christian Science Monitor. And he's writing against biotechnology. He says, it is now possible in principle to transfer human traits into animals and animal traits into humans. If we do this, or create new life forms with genes drawn from humans, we can also, in principle, reach a point at which the common, mainly implicit definition of humanness becomes blurred. What traits ultimately define a human? Where is the borderline of humanness? And if we do not know how to define human, what about human rights? And what I want you to see here is, well, it is true that transgenic experimentation, taking human genes, putting them in animals, or vice versa, or whatever, that is messing with categories in ways that we really do need to think through. He's not wrong. However, his idea that the problem is that it's messing with the definition of humanness and his sliding to human rights makes it sound as though we have an absolute, solid, agreed-upon definition of human being, and it is underpinning a universal definition of human rights. That's not true, right? Human rights are a very problematic concept. They are not universal. Would that they were. And the definition of human being is itself slippery. So it's not so much that this research is causing the concept to slide or changing what it means to be human as bringing to the surface the fact that the definitions are already not really stable. Okay, so now I want to move us to the movies. And if new scientific discoveries cause unresolved social questions to surface, they also get mixed up with global politics. Science and current events, other current events, are always getting mixed up together. Our anxieties about one are always spilling into the other. Permit me to introduce a wonderful contemporary monstrous clone, Tom Hardy's Shinzon in Star Trek Nemesis from 2002, the most recent Star Trek movie. And I'm going to give you a little background in the plot of this movie. So Shinzon was created by the Romulans, a planet out there in the whatever, as a plot. He was cloned from the beloved Captain Picard, Patrick Stewart, captain of the Enterprise, and he was. They built in an aging mechanism where Shinzon would age more quickly, and at a certain point he'd be the same age as Captain Picard, and they would substitute Shinzon for Captain Picard, and he would foment revolution within the Federation. Perish the thought. So the Romulan government fell, and Shinzon was suddenly left with nothing to do, right? They had created, again, a Frankenstein's monster. They had created a weapon of mass destruction. And remember, this is 2002. They didn't know what to do with him. He didn't fit in anywhere to Romulan society. So they banished him to a colonized twin planet, here we get the classics again, named Remus. And Remus is basically one large dilithium mine. Shinzon, very cute little 10-year-old boy, they show it, very endearing. They banish him to the dilithium mines of Remus. He becomes adopted by the Reman people. He becomes their revolutionary leader. And when the film starts, he has just assassinated most of the members of the Romulan Senate and caused a revolution, a Reman revolution, and has taken over Romulus. He has also hailed Captain Picard. And the scene you are about to see is the confrontation between Captain Picard and his clone Shinzon. And this is where Shinzon talks about both his feelings as a stateless terrorist, and remember this is 2002 again, and his feeling of being a clone. And note in the film two things while you're watching this. First of all, note how those two categories, political affiliation and biological being, start getting confused with each other. Note also how the mise en scène, which just means the cinematography, the scene that is created by the film, creates the two in very different terms. Shinzon is always photographed in the shadows. He's photographed in the same garb as the Reman, quote, monsters. Picard there are always close-ups on his face, and it's very expressive. His eyes are very soft, and he's backlit. He appears almost to glow. So there's a real emphasis on Picard's individualism and on Shinzon's monstrosity. So we'll watch the scene. I'll say a few words about it and move to X-Men.
Hello, Jean-Luc.
Why am I here? Why have you done this?
I was lonely.
What are you going to do?
I need a sample of your blood. What is it your Borg friends say? This resistance is futile. Oh yes, the android. The bait you couldn't refuse.
All of this so you could capture me.
Don't be so vain. After we found it, we had to make a few modifications. An extra memory port, a hidden transponder. I've now gained access to Starfleet's communications protocol. I now know the exact location of your entire fleet. You may go.
Where?
Out of my sight.
What is all this about?
It's about destiny, Picard. It's about a Riemann outcast.
You're not Riemann.
And I'm not quite human. So what am I? My life is meaningless as long as you're still alive. What am I while you exist? A shadow? An echo?
If your issues are with me, then deal with me. This has nothing to do with my ship. Nothing to do with the Federation.
Oh, but it does. We will no longer bow before anyone as slaves. Not the Romulans and not your mighty Federation. We are a race bred for war and conquest.
Are you ready to plunge the entire quadrant into war to satisfy your own personal demons?
It amazes me how little you know yourself.
I'm incapable of such an act.
You are me!
His face.
The same noble Picard blood runs through our veins. Had you lived my life, you'd be doing exactly as I am. So look in the mirror. See yourself. Consider that, Captain. I can think of no greater torment for you.
Shinzon, I'm a mirror for you as well.
Not for long, Captain. I'm afraid you won't survive to witness the victory of the echo over the voice.
Okay. Patrick Stewart's great. Look at that face. So, a couple of things I want you to notice from this, and my computer's very fussy about eject, so this is going to take a second. But a few things I want you to notice from this is that, first of all, there's the conventional language with which bioethicists always talk about how clones are going to feel. My life is meaningless as long as you're still alive. I'm the shadow, I'm the echo, and so forth. But really, as I said, this is as much a political story as it is a biological one. And it's unclear. He says, this is about a Riemann outcome. And Picard says to him, you're not Riemann, I'm not human either. So the film is constantly confusing political affiliation with biological entityness, whatever. And the confusion is, what it really comes down to is, again, that Shinzon is a Frankenstein's monster. He doesn't belong anywhere. He doesn't believe he belongs anywhere. So the film constructs him as monstrous, as a stateless terrorist, and as a clone. But the film also does some other very interesting things. And really this scene is setting up the theme that is going to run throughout the rest of the film and that runs throughout popular genomic fiction and film in general. And what the theme is setting up is the idea that are we nothing more than our environments and our genes? Do we have no human spirit? Do we have no will? And you saw how pained Picard was when Shinzon is saying, if you were me, you would be as monstrous as I am. You would be doing exactly what I'm doing. And Picard is just horrified at the thought that all his nobility and all his heroism may not be something he can take credit for, and somehow that he too is less human. And the film spends the rest of the time reaffirming an understanding of humanity as the expression of free will and spirit. And this is true of Gattaca, it's true of Minority Report. This is a constant theme that runs through popular culture in the genome age. The idea that humanity is real, that it is a question of spirit, that it is not a question of biology. One of the things people are really nervous about is if we start finding out that all of the traits that we think make us unique, make us human, our ability to love, our nobility, our ability to dream, if we find out those things are hardwired, that somehow we're not going to be human. And popular culture is all about reaffirming that definition of humanity. And ironically, it's Data, the beloved android, that reminds Picard of this, and then sacrifices himself for Picard and shows everybody what it means to be human. So clearly, if an android can show us what it means to be human, clearly it's not biological. And so the film does a few things. It associates monstrosity with expressions of determinism. It makes the clone and terrorist monstrous. And it also records a dominant concern and anxiety about what genomic information will tell us about ourselves, whether it will entail a paradigm shift concerning what it means to be human, and it shows us how we turn our anxieties into monsters. Now I want to move to one more example, and then I'll wrap up. And my next example is from X-Men. And X-Men is obviously not about clones. X-Men is about chimeras, or more accurately, mutants. And X-Men is, like Heroes, is actually, again, a story that we're telling a lot right now. The idea that suddenly you'll wake up one day and realize that you have a mutation and you can fly, or you can walk through walls, or you cannot be destroyed, or something like that. And what this is coming from, and if there are any scientists out there, forgive me, I'm about to give a very, very reductive description of punctuated equilibrium. It's from the concept of punctuated equilibrium, which is associated with the 1970s, although it had been kind of floating around before, and Stephen Jay Gould and others. And what it was, people think it was an argument with Darwin. It actually wasn't. It was another angle on Darwinian evolution. And where Darwin looked at sort of humanity overall, the questions asked by people interested in punctuated equilibrium were, if we get a small enough population, would it be possible for the mutations to circulate quickly enough that we could, at a certain point, give birth to another generation? Another species. How quickly could we move in an isolated population into a different species? To change, that literally that kind of evolutionary change. That was and again, very, very simplistic description. It gets picked up by wonderful writers like Greg Bear and Octavia Butler. Octavia Butler talks about xenogenesis, the birth of aliens, alien birth. Greg Bear has a wonderful novel called Darwin's Radio, where he talks about the idea that we have a retrovirus that is embedded in our DNA, and when certain stressors in the environment get too strong, that virus gets expressed and there's a sudden leap, and human beings start to give birth to a new species. And I'm going to, conclude with this idea. All hell breaks loose in Darwin's Radio. Human beings are very anxious about this new species. They round them up. They put them in concentration camps. Big surprise. The way that this is dealt with in Heroes and X-Men is even less scientific, because these are mutations that occur spontaneously, but they're the same mutations occurring in everyone. The mutations that are occurring in X-Men and Heroes, as I said, are individual. They're specific to individuals. So, you hit adolescence and suddenly you have wings. You can suddenly, as I said, walk through walls. You can disappear. This is the kind of thing that we're imagining, and this is part of, that kind of fanciful, mythic creature I've been talking about. So I'm going to show this one clip, explain it, and then conclude. I love this film. And watch this one. Watch the camera. Watch how the camera represents dehumanization.
Mutation. It is the key to our evolution.
Patrick Stewart.
It has enabled us to evolve from a single-celled organism into the dominant species on the planet. This process is slow, normally taking thousands and thousands of years. But every few hundred millennia, evolution leaps forward.
This is an incredible shot, and the cinematography in this film is incredible. Whatever you think of the plot, it is a gorgeously shot film. This is an image of the power of human will and human desire. Now, why do I say that? So the character you just saw is Magneto with Patrick Stewart, Dr. Xavier. They're like the two most powerful mutants. And he's very ambiguous because he's the one who's angry at humanity, but there's a good reason for it, and so we're sympathetic to him. And what we've just seen is his mutation, which is to be a magnet, to attract metal. His mutation is expressing itself for the first time in adolescence. And it's, in a sense, an extension of his incredibly powerful desire. So you saw him being pulled away from his family. You saw the anger, the helplessness on his father's face, the anguish on his mother's face, and the torture on his own face. And he responds by just willing that gate open. So if Shinzon is all about determinism and giving up on the human will, this film is about the absolute power of the human will, so much so that it turns into a mutation. Now, this is both how these characters are monstrous, in the sense that the mutation is characterological. It's an expression of some fundamental thing in him, but they're also enviable. I mean, this is almost suprahuman, right? This is humanity times 10. And that's I think, how these characters work and how they become mythic. They represent this incredible sense of possibility and what we imagine human being might be. Now, I want to sum up very quickly, about 5 more minutes, by talking about evolution, and I've mentioned it throughout. You heard Patrick Stewart say at the beginning, mutation is the key to human growth. But we fear change. Octavia Butler's Xenogenesis trilogy is also about that, and Greg Bear. I mean, this is a common theme. We fear change. And I think at the core of the response to these myths about genomics is our combined fear and excitement about what human beings might become. Have you ever stopped to think that, we talk about evolution, and, people who accept evolution accept that, we evolved from, primates in the past and so forth and so on. Do you ever hear people discuss what we might be becoming, whatever, what we might become? You don't, right? There's this implicit tacit agreement, I think, to assume that we're somehow the telos at the end of evolution. But in fact, if you think about it in Darwinian terms, if we don't blow ourselves up, we're either going to go extinct or we're going to evolve. And if we evolve, what are we going to be? And I think this concern is at the core of a lot of these genomic myths. Is evolution going to be something better? Is it another word for extinction? And what will evolved human beings think of us? And there's a very humorous manifestation of this right now. How many of you have seen the Geico commercial with the cavemen? So Geico says, so simple, even a caveman can do it. And then they show all these scenarios of these cavemen that are living amongst us that are hurt by this and angered by this. And it was so popular, they've actually made a television series called The Cavemen with these characters. Now, I think these characters are a humorous manifestation of what we're fundamentally afraid of, which is if we get these evolved human beings, and if they are perhaps better than we are, more adapted to the environment, and I know that doesn't mean the same as better, but I think in our fantasy it does. If they're more adapted than we are, what are they going to think about us? Are we going to become second-class citizens? How are they going to treat us? And I think this is a really primal concern that is at the heart of these stories. Now, the creatures I've been looking at express excitement and anxiety in three areas that I've been talking about. One, the changes genomics might produce, and that's the whole designer eugenics that I've been talking about. We might produce creatures that are superior to us. This is Gattaca. The information genomics might give us about ourselves, right? The determinism that I talked about with Shinzan and Picard. And finally, one that particularly interests me, and that is the genomics as a depiction. Let me get my last slide up here. Genomics, or maybe not. There it is. Genomics as a depiction of social changes that have already taken place or are in the process of taking place. Some of you may remember this 1993 Time magazine simulation, and what they did is they took characteristics of all the ethnicities and the percent in which those ethnicities are represented in the U.S. population, and they made a human being, a simulated human being out of this. The generation coming of age now, in college with those of you who are undergraduates, is more racially mixed, ethnically mixed, and religiously mixed than any generation in human history. You are the wonderful product of globalization, and younger people even more so. I think this is great. Lots of people think this is great. But it's messing with our social categories. And a lot of people are really anxious about it. So one question I would leave you with is, to what extent does genomics register displaced anxieties about social changes? So these are the three things that I think go into these creatures I've been looking at. Now, myths arise when the rapid production of new theories and insights in science infuses with our most profound anxieties about social transformation. It's not surprising that genomics, with its strange mix of science and entertainment, breeds a mythology for our contemporary moment. Fascination with ancestry, going back to human history, the creatures that populate these stories. These weird tales of clones and chimeras offer to turn tantalizing remnants of a forgotten past into glimpses of a haunted future. We have an image of humanity at risk, and we have an immediate response in these stories of the reaffirmation of humanity defined in the very culturally specific terms, free will, human spirit, and so forth, that I've been talking about. Now, finally, why is it important to understand the mythic nature of these stories? Myths are wonderful expressions of the human imagination. They powerfully appeal to the collective imagination of a group. But For those reasons, it's so much harder for us to question them. And there's then the increased possibility of negative consequences, stigma, of misapprehension about the science and the nature of the discoveries. And they actually prevent the kind of introspection that I've been arguing these works of fiction, if we approach them critically, can present. They forestall introspection of precisely the questions that most need to be challenged, a la my anecdote, a la my anecdote, a la my anecdote,